A to Z Mysteries, Book Number 19, The School Skeleton, by Ron Roy. Chapter 5. The next morning they met in front of the school before the first bus showed up. There were only a couple of cars in the teacher's parking lot. "I hope Mrs. Waters isn't late today," Josh said as they entered the school. "We need to get these notes in the mailboxes before the teachers get here." They hurried along the silent hallway to the principal's office. Mrs. Waters was just taking off her coat. "Mr. Dillon isn't in yet," she said when the kids walked in. "We came to see you," Dink said. "Well, isn't that nice?" the secretary said, flipping a page on her calendar. "Goodness, where did March go already? Now, how can I help you kids?" Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose explained their idea. "You honestly think one of our teachers took that skeleton?" she asked. "We don't know," Dink said. "But the footprint looks like an adult's. Would you mind putting these in the right mailboxes?" He handed Mrs. Waters the 8 notes they'd printed. She read one and smiled. "Of course I will," she said. "And I wish you luck finding Mr. Bones. I know Mr. Dillon will be happy to have this mystery solved." Mrs. Waters stood up, walked to the teachers' mailboxes, and placed the notes in 8 different slots. The kids thanked her and left. Just then the bell rang and students began rushing through the front door. They walked to their room and found Mrs. Eagle at her desk. My, look who's eager to get started," she said. Once more the kids explained about the footprint, the 8 notes, and their plan for finding the person who took the school skeleton. They showed her Josh's drawing of the footprint. "And you plan to ask each teacher if you can measure his or her feet?" Mrs. Eagle asked, grinning. "That footprint is our only clue," Ruth Rose said. "We want our class to win the tickets," Josh said. Mrs. Eagle smiled. "All right, if the teachers agree, you 3 may leave the room later," she said. The morning seemed to last forever. Dink kept glancing at the clock, and Josh kept sighing and fidgeting at his desk. Finally, during math, a 5th grader came into the room and handed Mrs. Eagle a stack of papers. She looked through the stack, then called Dink up to her desk. "Here are your responses," she whispered. "All 8 have checked yes. You might as well go now, and good luck." Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose quietly left the room. They brought with them 8 sheets of drawing paper, a ruler, Josh's footprint sketch, and Ruth Rose's list of teachers' names. "Guys, I just thought of something," Ruth Rose said in the hallway. "Whoever made that footprint yesterday might be wearing different shoes today." "You're right," Dink said. "So anyone whose shoe is about the right size, we'll ask if they wore the same shoes yesterday." They started walking down the hall. On one classroom door, someone had hung a sign. It said, "Come home, Mr. Bones, we miss you." There was a drawing of a skeleton under the words. 3 girls wearing skeleton masks campered down the hallway. "Mr. Bones, where are you?" one of the girls said. The other 2 laughed at their friend. Outside the 5th grade room, a paper skeleton hung from the ceiling. "The whole school is looking for the skeleton," Josh muttered. "We have to find it first." "Then we'd better get going," Ruth Rose said. "Maybe no one else knows about the footprint yet." First on her list was Miss Alubicki, the kindergarten teacher. They showed her Josh's drawing and asked if she would let them chase her left foot. "Of course," Miss Alubicki said, smiling. "But I can already tell you that foot is a lot bigger than mine." The little kids giggled as Josh chased around her foot on a piece of paper. Outside in the hall, Josh compared it with his drawing. "It's definitely not her," he said. "Miss Alubicki's foot is only 7 inches long." Ruth Rose drew a big X in front of Miss Alubicki's name on her list. After the name, she wrote, "Too small." They went next door and peeked into Mr. Diodado's first grade class. The tall teacher was writing at the chalkboard, "Who stole the school skeleton?" Dink knocked, and Mr. Diodado looked up. "We have visitors, class," he said, grinning. While Josh chased Mr. D's sneaker onto a sheet of paper, the first graders gathered around. Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose thanked Mr. D and left. In the hall, Josh measured what he had chased onto the paper. Mr. Diodado's sneaker was almost 13 inches long. The bottom tread had little squares, not zigzags. "Cross him off, too," Dink said. Ruth Rose put an X by Mr. Diodado's name and wrote "Too big." "6 more names to go," Josh said, glancing at Ruth Rose's list. "What if it's none of them?" "It must be someone on this list," Dink said. "How could a stranger sneak into the school and walk out with a skeleton?" One by one, the kids chased teachers' shoes onto the paper and measured them. They compared the tracings with Josh's drawing. One by one, Ruth Rose put X's next to the names. With only one more name to go, Ruth Rose's list looked like this. Kindergarten, Miss Alubicki, too small. First grade, Mr. Diodado, too big. Second grade, Miss Crumpet, too small. Third grade, Mrs. Eagle, too small. Fourth grade, Mr. Quacho, absent Monday. Fifth grade, Mrs. Golden, too small. Principal, Mr. Dillon, was wearing loafers Monday. Secretary, Mrs. Waters, too small. Nurse, Miss Shotsky, too small. Art teacher, Mr. Love, too big. Music teacher, Miss Aria, too small. Janitor, Mr. Nieder, way too big. Gym teacher, Mr. Palmer. Not one of these people could have made that footprint, Ruth Rose said. Who's the last name? Dink asked. Mr. Palmer, the gym teacher, she answered. Josh crossed his fingers. Maybe he's the one, he said. They found Mr. Palmer sitting behind his desk. He smiled when the kids walked into his office. I read your note, he said. Thanks for seeing us, Dink said. May we measure your shoes? Mr. Palmer grinned. Sure, but I guarantee I didn't steal that skeleton yesterday morning. I was in the emergency room at the hospital. He stood up and held out his left foot. There was a white cast on it. I slipped on some ice getting into my car yesterday, he said. He pointed to a pair of crutches leaning in a corner. I can hardly carry my lunch, let alone a skeleton. Chapter 6. I hope your foot gets better fast, Dink said. Thanks, and I hope you find the skeleton, Mr. Palmer said. The kids left and walked toward their room. We must have figured something wrong, Josh said. One of these people has to be the perp. The perp? Dink said. Josh grinned. Yeah, you know, the guy that did it. So if it wasn't anyone on this list, who was it? Ruth Rose asked. That footprint didn't get there by magic. I wonder if it could be a chick footprint, Dink said. What do you mean? Josh asked. I read a story once about some kids who made fake bear tracks to fool their parents, Dink said. They taped some rolled-up socks onto an old rake. Then they stamped bear tracks in the snow all around their house. But why would the skeleton snatcher leave a fake footprint? Ruth Rose asked. Dink shrugged. Why would anyone steal the school skeleton in the first place? Well, whoever did it is pretty mean, Josh grumbled. Playing tricks on innocent kids isn't nice. Dink and Ruth Rose burst out laughing. They were still giggling as they got close to their room. Wait a sec, I want to put this drawing away, Josh said. Stop, Ruth Rose shouted as Josh stepped up to his locker. Don't move. What? Josh gasped, smacking his chest with one hand. "You almost gave me a heart attack." "Look what you almost stepped on." Ruth Rose pointed to a circle of white powder on the floor. In the center of the circle was a footprint. It was a very familiar footprint. Ruth Rose grabbed Josh's footprint sketch from his hand and knelt next to the new print. "Check it out, guys," she said. Dink and Josh bent down for a closer look. It was a left footprint with a zigzag pattern. When Ruth Rose placed Josh's drawing on the floor, the two footprints were identical. "Oh my gosh!" Josh cried. "The skeleton snatcher was here." Just then Mrs. Eagle popped her head through the door. "What's going on?" she asked. Ruth Rose pointed at the footprint. "Look, Mrs. Eagle." "He's back," Josh said. "And he came right to your locker," Dink added, grinning. "The zombie is after you." "No way," Josh argued. "See, the footprint is halfway between my locker and yours." "Maybe he stole something from one of your lockers," Ruth Rose said. Mrs. Eagle knelt and put her finger in the white stuff. Then she lifted her finger to her nose. She said. "This smells like talcum powder. Why don't you boys open your lockers?" "You go first," Josh told Dink. "Okay," Dink said. "Since you're such a scaredy cat." "Am not." "Are too." "Boys," Mrs. Eagle said. Dink pulled open his locker door. His jacket hung on a hook. On the shelf, his books were neatly arranged. His lunch bag sat on top of his books. "Nothing's missing," Dink said. "Now you, Josh." "No problem," Josh said, flipping up the latch on his locker door. His jacket hung on the hook. His books were stacked on the shelf. His brown bag lunch was perched on the books. But in front of the lunch bag was a twisted piece of white paper. "What's that?" Josh asked. "I didn't put that there." Dink leaned close and whispered, "Maybe it's a note from the snatcher." "Yeah, right," Josh said, grabbing the paper twist. "Hey, there's something inside." When Josh untwisted the paper, a metal object fell onto the floor. But Dink, Josh, Ruth Rose, and their teacher were all staring at the paper in Josh's hand. It was a drawing of a smiling skeleton. Someone had sketched a big 2 in the center of its forehead. Mrs. Eagle bent down and picked up what had fallen. "How odd," she said, showing the kids a shiny key.